Hey, welcome back. Today's video is about neck turning brass because sometimes you should just leave it the way it came out of the box. So let's talk about why you would turn brass and why you should not turn brass, and even the context of use and how that affects the decision. Before we get too far along, we have to talk about safety because certain reamer designs, like this 308 reamer that I've used for years, have too tight of a neck for unturned brass of many different brands. As a matter of fact, it comes down to not only your chamber, but the brand of brass that you're using in that chamber. Because, for instance, Winchester brass and Lapua brass have two entirely different neck thicknesses in 308 Winchester. That reamer I just showed you can shoot unturned Winchester brass from 15 or 20 years ago with no problem whatsoever. However, it won't even chamber a piece of Lapua brass without turning it. So be forewarned that your brass decision can affect whether you need to turn or not, because not all no-turn reamers are made equal. So I'm sure you're asking, how do I tell what my neck diameter in my chamber is? There's only really one way to check, and that is with SeroSafe. In other words, casting the chamber and then measuring. On my chambers, they measure exactly what the reamer calls out, plus about half a thousandths. You have to give your gunsmith a little bit of room to work after all. So how much clearance is enough clearance for a no-turn chamber? I say it's a minimum of 3/1000ths of an inch. It could be bigger, but 3/1000ths will be safe to shoot until you figure out whether it's enough or not. We'll get into that in just a moment. Why 3/1000ths? Well, there's enough variation from piece of brass to piece of brass in an unturned configuration that you don't want to get too close. You're going to need to measure some loaded rounds. And I mean more than one. 5 or 10 of them, and find the biggest one. Now, the biggest one of that batch, measured with a micrometer, is your loaded round diameter for that batch. You need to have 3/1000ths bigger than that diameter in the neck of your chamber, or you just need to turn the brass from the very beginning, because it could get unsafe in a real hurry. 2/1000ths is getting kind of skinny. Now, we can shoot 2/1000ths with turned brass, but with unturned brass, I would never do that because it's just too risky. So the next test is a rule of thumb test. It's not diagnostic per se, but at the same time, I found that it worked quite well for me. If I bring a piece of fired brass home after a range session and I can't get a bullet back into it without significant friction, the neck clearance is just too tight and I need to turn that brass. That's what happened to me on the 7 Violator. I had to come back and start turning that brass, and it improved my ESSD and my accuracy because I wasn't getting the occasional grab of the bullet by the chamber. Sometimes you just got to make that little adjustment to make the rifle shoot well. But typically, you aren't going to see that depending on your context. So let's talk about context. Context is broken down into really kind of 3 general categories. We have hunting, we have competition shooting, and we have people that shoot for fun. And they just enjoy tinkering. Let's talk about the tinkerers and the enjoyment shooters, because shooting should be a joy. It should not be a burden. So if you shoot for fun and you want to neck turn your brass, please go ahead, have fun, do it. There is absolutely nothing in this video to tell you you should not do it. If you think it's going to be something that makes your accuracy better, your precision better, your fun more, go for it. I encourage you to do that. On the other hand, if you're a fun shooter and you don't want to go to the effort of neck turning brass and you're wondering if it's going to make a real difference in your shooting, I can tell you right now, unless you are shooting an absolute top of the line bench rest quality rifle, it's probably not going to make any significant difference for you, unless you have brass that really sucks, in which case I would advise you to buy better brass rather than buying a bunch of tooling to make your poor brass shoot better. Let's move on to hunters. Hunters, especially big game hunters, my answer for neck turning is, unless you have a chamber that has to have neck turning for safety purposes, absolutely not. Neck turning has some negative connotations to it that you need to understand. The first is the formation of donuts. No matter how much you cut into the shoulder, you are going to increase the likelihood of a donut by neck turning the brass. For competition shooters, that's not a big deal. We deal with donuts all the time, and we really don't care about them. But in a hunting context, especially with a magazine-fed rifle where you have to push the bullet-bearing surface into the case sometimes, that can be a real negative for your shooting and for your brass life. So be very careful about choosing neck turning if you're going to have to shove a bunch of bearing surface all the way through the neck. The next thing that neck turning does is it takes material off. And in doing so, it makes the brass less robust, less durable. It is more likely to get dented, bent, or even destroyed, going in and out of dies, getting dropped on the ground, stepped on every once in a while like most brass does, especially in a hunting context. And the other thing is it adds a bunch of time and effort to your loading process that doesn't necessarily translate into a better probability of kill for your big shot. So I would advise you, if you are a hunter, if your primary use for your rifle is hunting, not to neck turn. Get a chamber that will accept no neck turn brass and just go for it. Once again, check for safety. Make sure you have that minimum of 3 thousandths of clearance. Moving into competition, this is where things get really wild. If you're a bench rest shooter and you've been shooting bench rest for a while, keep doing what you're doing. It's working for you most likely. As a matter of fact, for bench rest shooting, I would always turn brass necks because there is a very small amount of brass. The brass is carefully handled, and honestly, it's going to give you a better outcome probably over time. So for bench rest, absolutely, I would turn necks. F-class, now we're getting into that maybe range. With F-class, I've seen several really top-of-the-line shooters shooting no-turn necks that were doing excellent work and winning matches with it. So I can't say that you have to turn necks in order to win. Now, if you like turning necks or you think turning necks adds to your precision a little bit, please go right ahead and do it. For me, I turn necks in F-class because I started F-class back in the day when turning necks was the right thing to do. I'm kind of a FUD when it comes to neck turning. I think that it's the right way to do it just because I learned to do it when I came up through the ranks. Perhaps that isn't the right thing to think anymore. Who knows? It might have been the wrong thing to do. You never know. Let's talk about other sports like PRS, for instance. In PRS, absolutely not. I would never have a neck turn chamber for PRS. Honestly, I have a chamber in my dasher that is a 274 neck just to make sure I have plenty of clearance for this alpha brass. I do not want to neck turn that brass for any reason. Number one, it is a huge amount of labor that is absolutely unnecessary to get the level of precision needed. Likewise, it makes that brass tender, and we don't want to tear it up any more than we absolutely have to because we lose enough of it as it is. If you want to cry over losing brass, spend 15 minutes per piece of brass doing brass prep and then lose that sucker on the first firing and see how you feel about it. Then there's NRA high power style shooting. NRA high power style shooting absolutely does not need to be neck turned. There's no reason to do that. We've demonstrated in F-class that there is plenty of precision for F-class without neck turning, and as a result, that means that that double-sized target that everybody else is shooting at is way bigger than is absolutely needed, so they don't need to neck turn their brass for precision. As a matter of fact, adding complexity to your processes is a negative for your shooting because you probably need to practice more being a position shooter. And then there's the various kinds of local competitions that are not necessarily of any particular nature. In those cases, if it's a bench rest style shooting event like a fly shoot or some of the unusual gong shoots that are shot off of benches, then neck turning might be of value. On the other hand, if it is anything else, any kind of positional shooting, I would say don't neck turn, especially with a magazine-fed rifle. Magazine-fed rifles are just so hard on brass that neck turn brass really doesn't do well there. I would advise against it. So in summary, you would neck turn if your chamber demands it, or if you change brass to a brass that's thicker than your chamber was designed for. And last but not least, only in bench rest or maybe F-class. Otherwise, it is not necessary and is a waste of resources for you in order to get the best out of your shooting. Remember, the shooting system is not just the rifle, the brass, the powder, the bullet, and the primer. It includes you. And if you don't get the training you need because you're spending all of your time doing exotic processes, you are probably going to defeat yourself in the end. All right, guys, until next time, shoot straight. Think about the processes that you're doing and whether they are really helping you. And I'll see you in the next video.